this, and again, this comes from the information through the public to action. China banned at government banquets, shark fin was banned. This was very recently. That's a major change. And then most recently, in fact, I picked this up 2 days ago. I need 3 hands. Oops. Okay. That's my camera thing. What this is a symbolic victory in shark fin fight. This is Cathay Pacific, which has banned the transport of shark fin on airplanes. This is a major step towards a more sustainable approach by companies. And the reason they've done this, it's not just singling out shark fins, it's to do with their policy on sustainable use. And so that has a lot of other implications for other species. Again, this is part of a process, and it's a long, ongoing process. So it's been very, very interesting. And I think particularly in the case of the shark, and I dwell on the shark because it has this lot of history, and there are a lot of things that have come out of these listings. I think there'll be knock-on effects for other species, and groupers, which is the group I work on, is certainly, I plan going to be one of them. But anyway, talking of groupers, the whole of the grouper, the groupers were listed, 163 species, and we identified overfishing in particular, and overfishing especially on their spawning aggregations as being major threat factors. And you've heard about spawning aggregation fishing from the tunas, and I've heard in other talks given at the meeting today. And what's happening is that there's an increasing recognition through these kinds of assessments that there are particular types of area-associated phenomena, like spawning aggregations, which could become the target for particular conservation action. So very important. These again come out of the assessments. And a lot of this information that goes into the assessments is not necessarily readily available online, in publications. The experts pull them together in these workshops and put them into the assessments, and they become available and part of our understanding and knowledge. And more recent assessments.
What is that yellow grouper? Is that just a growth stage?
Say again?
What was the bright yellow grouper?
Just a xanthic phase.
Oh no, this is the xanthic phase.
Okay.
Yeah, it's beautiful. That's really beautiful. And then just really last on assessments. More recently, assessments have been done on things like the croakers, and Bruce is already talking about tuna and billfishes. But on the croakers, this was a very the documentation for croakers has not been very good. Very important commercially. Very vulnerable in estuarine environments where there are spawning aggregations and there are concentrations. A lot of problems with the croakers, and again, the red list assessments are really highlighting these. And I think this is another group we need to be focusing on. So, strategic planning for red list assessments. A further aspect of the work we do and are interested in is very closely with the GMSA. Through the expertise created by the GMSA project, we identify groups, new groups, to be looking at more species. So really factoring up. Then just on policy and instruments, I mentioned these need to be identified to improve the effectiveness of these listings. So one of the things we're doing now with the Global Marine Polar Program within IUCN is looking at the regional fishery management organizations and authorities to see whether we can better input information into the process, into the forums. Because there's actually very little input, as far as we understand, across a range of threatened species into these fishery forums. So we really need to be getting a stronger voice. So we're looking into that as one aspect of making these red list assessments work for us. And of course, CITES for me has been really quite thrilling in terms of the fact that this is a large international convention for the trade, for international traded species, to ensure on Appendix 2 at least that they are sustainably traded. And the fact that there are some species on CITES now is, I think, is a very strong recognition that overfishing and extinction risk, they're all part of sort of some continuum. Not completely separate things, that we have to think about some marine species just in terms of conservation and the majority of marine species in terms of use, but it's part of a continuum. And all of these species, not all of them, several of these species, I would say, are commercially important for food or for medicinal use. and so we have commercial species which are listed because of their threat. There is a lot of resistance by many countries to include species on the CITES appendices, because the countries are saying that they're able to manage their own fisheries, or that the RFMOs are going to manage the fisheries. But I think the next few years we're going to see to what extent that this is true. That's the real testing time. And then the last, individual groups like this group of Grasses group, we follow up on these CITES listings, and we follow through to see whether or not these listings work. And then the last thing I want to talk about was just gaps in knowledge. And there are several gaps in knowledge that we really need to be filling. We need to be looking at bycatch species. Many species are taken as bycatch. We have very little information on most bycatch species, and there are a few threatened ones which are included, but actually so few invertebrates at least have been assessed, we really don't know what's happening amongst bycatch. It's a very pressing issue, so bycatch really does need to be looked at. Marine protected area planning, we need to have this species information made more readily available for marine protected area planning. And this is a big problem. It's out there, but it's getting it in the right place at the right time for this kind of planning. We need to be using those assessed as DD and NT, those species. We need to be getting more information on these. And we also, this is part of the priorities of the Marine Conservation Subcommittee, is to look at trade and trade hotspots and where we could be strategically effective. And one particular example, again with shark fin, this is a number of countries and by year, and you can see for shark fin, there's upwards of 140 countries have been used in shark fin trade. What we can do is look at that, and of those, there's a relatively small number of countries, and we can strategically work with those countries. So understanding the trade, and in particular in places like Hong Kong, which are import and transshipment hotspots, is very, very important for moving towards solutions. And then finally, we need to get the word out, and that's what our Marine Conservation Subcommittee, we try to do. We're a sort of more of a conduit, or not even coordinator, but sort of a conduit, taking information in, getting it out. And one of the products that we did a couple of years ago was intended really as a way to get a lot of information out to the public, but in a way that was very accessible by the public. And so I think there's a lot of this kind of information we need to do. There's a lot of science that we need to get out to the public in a more digestible way. And then in that way, the public supports policy, they support issues, measures such as seafood choice, this kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of need now. The myth has been shattered, but we've got to get, more or less, but we've got to get this information out. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Yvonne, and I'd like to call our next speaker. For the interest of time, I think we should reserve our questions for after all the presentations are done. Thank you. So, Nick, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. While we're on the topic of going beyond the red list, I'm going to talk to you about a new initiative. The Shark Specialist Group, as Yvonne has mentioned, has been around for 20 years, but over the last decade we've assessed all of the 1,000 or so sharks raised in chimeras. And you know, this is like painting the Forth Road Bridge. Once you finish, you've got to start again, and not least because we're discovering a new chondrichthyon once every 3 weeks, and we've done that for, on average, the last 30 years. So notwithstanding the need to continue red listing and updating our red list assessments, we're also moving towards generating red list indicators of the kind that have been very successful at helping us understand meeting IEG targets or previous 2010 targets, such as has been developed by Stuart Butcher here. But I'm going to talk about a new path beyond red listing, and this is the path of species conservation strategies, and this is largely drawn from the terrestrial world and has been enabled by the revitalization of the species conservation planning process within the IUCN SSC. And broadly, the way it works is that you develop a vision, and our vision for sawfishes is a world where robust sawfishes are restored within thriving aquatic ecosystems. that vision is achieved through goals and concrete actions. And our time-bound actions are by 2020. And I'd encourage you to find this book. It's got a horrendous URL, but it's very easy to find if you search for Mark Stanley Price, who is the chair for species conservation planning. So we managed to engage with Mark at a very early stage, who is charged with revitalizing the species conservation planning process within the SSC, not only to rethink how we do planning, but also to promote planning and start conservation planning. So Mark came to us at a very good time for us to think about where we go next with, now that we've red listed all convictions. And the short story was, we looked through the list of families and their rate of threat, and it turned out that one family came out top in the rate of threat. Sawfishes have, all 7 species are critically endangered, which pretty much makes it the most endangered family of marine organisms in the world today.
Which family?
Sawfishes.
Sawfishes.
Not swordfishes.
Sawfishes.
Not saw sharks.
You set it up.
Sawfishes. Between my Northern Irish accent and Lucy's North American accent, people routinely confuse sawfishes and sawfishes. And this is the nature of the beast, and this photograph doesn't really do justice to the nature of the beast, because these grow to 7 meters long, which is probably about the width of this room. So they're found throughout shallow subtropical waters of the world, and they're live bearers, and their reproductive investment is such that they probably have the largest ovum in the animal kingdom. It's the size of a grapefruit and bigger. It's probably bigger than an emu or ostrich egg. So they're reproductively very unique. So in addition to their size correlates with a low rate of population growth and a long generation time, which makes you intrinsically vulnerable to high levels of mortality. The second feature that makes sawfishes vulnerable to a high level to extinction really is the toothed rostrum. This frequently gets entangled in all sorts of nets. So these are gill nets, but they also get hoovered up in trawls, particularly shrimp trawls, which shrimps unfortunately coexist with sawfishes in their prime habitat, which tends to be mangrove estuaries. And this was a sawfish capture in Kerala, in India, in May last year, and you can see both the sheer size of it and the nature of the entanglement problem. It's not necessarily not easy to often remove and release these animals from valuable gear, particularly in artisanal fisheries where they're very resistant to the loss of the gear. Sorry, these were duplicated. So where do we start with this planning process? Well, sure we had red list assessments, but they were very basic. We wanted to get a handle on what we were dealing with, so part of that process was engaging a community to help us figure out where sawfishes lived, and it turned out we were very lucky. There was a national sawfish encounter database out of Florida, which is aspiring to build an international sawfish encounter database, and this was really to give anglers and the general public an opportunity to report sightings of sawfishes, and also to gather together reports that turned up in the local media. We pulled together a database from National Marine Fisheries Service in NOAA in Florida, and we started looking around museums for their type specimen records and newspaper records worldwide, and of course that's much easier with Google these days than maybe it would have been a decade ago. And we soon found about 10,000 records. There was some duplication and some filtering to do, of varying quality of taxonomic identification, but we just thought we'd just start with sawfishes, Pristis spa, and look at the record distribution by year and by country. And this is what we learned from that exercise, and this is mapped by EEZ, so clearly sawfishes aren't found in southern Australia, and they aren't found up the Pacific coast of the US all the way to Vancouver where I live. But these are the countries where records were found over the last 200 years, and there are even records in the Central African Republic there, and we don't know if that's a trade record or it's a capture record. There are records in China, but we suspect that these are trade records because sawfishes are culturally iconic. They're very often given as tribute to emperors, for example, so we think that Chinese records are actually trade records. We can also look to see where are the records for the last 10 years, and The countries in red here are the countries where we have not had a record. Bear in mind it's largely a passive system of gathering data. There hasn't been a record in the last decade. So West Africa is particularly troubling for us because there have been targeted searches for sawfishes at landing sites since I think about 2001, and there have only been 4 records of sawfish being captured in West Africa in the last decade. There is potentially a stronghold of sawfishes in Guinea-Bissau in the Vijayas archipelago. So the other thing to note, this is not a new message to you guys, but conservation planning is typically applied to single species, hyenas, cheetahs, in single countries like Djibouti. For example, we're facing a massive planning problem with 7 species distributed across the coastal waters of 80 countries. So we can't just transform national protection in one country, we've got to do it across 80 countries. And how did we set about doing this? Well, we started weaving a tapestry on building capacity through a network. And we literally mail-shotted all of the likely fisheries agencies and environmental agencies throughout the distribution of sawfishes. And we managed to find 134 sawfish network members in 50 countries. And we brought a subset of those members